The night Grant Mercer accepted his award, he told my story to 200 people. He got most of it right. He got one detail wrong. And that one detail, 4 words about a prayer that never happened, is the reason his $2.1 billion company no longer exists. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you what the room looked like from table 17. Table 17 is where they put the people who aren't important enough to sit closer but can't be turned away at the door. Near the back. Near the emergency exit. The kind of table where the bread arrives last and the servers stop making eye contact halfway through the entree. I didn't mind. I've slept in worse places than a hotel ballroom. I've eaten worse things than cold dinner rolls. And I've sat across from worse men than Grant Mercer, while waiting for the right moment to say what needed to be said. The Adolphus Hotel, Dallas, Texas, 9:15 in the evening. The kind of room that costs more per hour to rent than most people make in a month. Crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, champagne that came in actual crystal, not the cheap glass flutes they give you at wedding receptions, where the bar runs out by 8. 200 guests. Every one of them convinced they were important. Most of them right about that. Grant Mercer, standing at the podium in a $4,000 suit, holding a glass trophy the size of a small child. He was the most important person in the room. At least, that's what he believed. I was wearing a gray blazer I bought at Macy's 3 years ago for $89. My shoes had a scuff on the left toe I'd tried to cover with a black marker that morning. My car was a 2017 Honda Accord with 94,000 miles on it, parked in the self-park garage because I wasn't about to pay $28 for valet. Nobody at that event knew my name. Nobody at that event knew what I'd done with 18 years of my life. And Grant Mercer, the man at the podium, the man with the trophy, the man whose face was on the cover of Defense Industry Quarterly. 3 issues running. Grant Mercer had no idea that the woman sitting quietly at table 17, eating her cold dinner roll, was the reason he had anything to say at all. Here's what he said. 17 years ago, I heard a story that changed the way I understood leadership. A soldier alone, cut off, surrounded, made a decision in the worst moment of his life that defined everything I've tried to build. He stopped. In the middle of the chaos, with everything falling apart around him, he stopped. He prayed. And that prayer became the foundation of this company's values. Of my values. Of everything I am going to ask you to invest in tonight. The room went quiet, the way rooms go quiet when people believe what they're hearing. I watched them believe it. 200 people, champagne glasses half raised, nodding slowly. I watched a woman in the front row press her hand to her chest. I watched a man in a navy blazer close his eyes for a moment, moved. I watched Grant Mercer pause at exactly the right beat, the practice pause of someone who has told this story 473 times and knows precisely where the silence lands hardest. And I sat at table 17, very still, and thought about the 40 minutes I spent on a mountain in Afghanistan in August of 2009. I didn't pray. I didn't have time to pray. I had a field knife in one hand and my own femoral artery in the other, and the only words I said out loud for 40 minutes were times don't stop, don't stop, don't stop, times not to God, not to anyone listening, just to myself, because the alternative to saying them was stopping. And stopping meant dying. And dying meant 2 people who were already gone had taken all 4 of us with them instead of just 2. So no, I didn't pray. And the fact that Grant Mercer believed I did, the fact that the man who had built a $2.1 billion company on that story had gotten that one detail wrong, told me everything I needed to know about where he'd gotten the story from, because the man who sold it to him wasn't there. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. Not the click of heels, not the shuffle of a server. Something purposeful, moving against the current of the room. I turned slightly. A woman, late 30s, press badge from the Dallas Morning News clipped to her lapel, small digital recorder in her left hand. Eyes that had the particular focused quality of someone who has spent a long time looking at things other people don't want looked at. She pulled out the empty chair across from me. She sat down. She placed the recorder on the white tablecloth between us gently, the way you place something you intend to use. She looked at me. And then she said 4 words that no one had said to me in 15 years. You were there, weren't? Not a question. Up at the podium, Grant Mercer was still talking. The applause was building. In 45 seconds, 200 people were going to rise to their feet for a standing ovation. And I was going to let them. Because what happened next didn't need an audience. Not yet. My name is Diane Calloway. Master Sergeant, United States Army, retired, Kunar Province, Afghanistan. the 14th of August, 2009. I have carried what happened that night in my chest for 15 years like a stone I couldn't put down. Tonight, I put it down. And I need to take you back to the beginning, because the beginning is the only way you'll understand why the ending looked the way it did. And why Grant Mercer, standing at that podium with his trophy and his prayer and his $4,000 suit, had already lost everything. He just didn't know it yet. I grew up in Harlan County, Kentucky, which is the kind of place that teaches you early that the world is not arranged fairly, and that the sooner you make peace with that fact, the longer you'll last. My mother worked the overnight shift at a regional hospital for 22 years. My father installed drywall until his back gave out, then installed it some more because the alternative was not installing drywall, and we still needed to eat. I was the oldest of 3. I learned to cook at 9, do laundry at 10, and file the family's taxes at 14, because my parents worked too many hours to sit down with a form. Nobody in Harlan County in 1995 told a girl she should join the Army. The Army was something men did, or something boys did when they ran out of other options. I joined because I had read every book in the county library that interested me by the time I was 16, because the nearest college was an hour away and cost money we didn't have, and because a recruiter named Sergeant First Class Patricia Owens came to my high school in the spring of my junior year and spoke to a group of 12 students in the gymnasium, and was, without question, the most competent person I had ever been in the same room with in my entire life. She was 5'4". She had a jaw like a closing door. She answered every question those 12 students asked her with complete sentences that contained no filler words, no hedging, no performance of certainty that was secretly uncertainty. When a boy in the back row asked if women could handle combat, she looked at him for 3 full seconds without changing her expression and said, "I've handled things you don't have words for yet." Then she moved on to the next question. I signed my contract 6 weeks later. I did my basic at Fort Jackson, 8 at Fort Lee, first duty station at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, 3 hours from home, which felt like the right distance, far enough to become someone new. Close enough to drive back when my mother's back went out in 2001, and she needed someone to fill the gaps for 2 weeks, while my father managed the drywall. I deployed to Iraq in 2003, then again in 2005, then Afghanistan in 2007, then Afghanistan again in 2009, Kunar Province, the second time, the time that matters for this story. In those 18 years, I learned things that take a long time to learn and longer to explain. I learned that fear is not the opposite of courage, boredom is. That the most dangerous people in any room are the ones who have never had to live with the consequences of being wrong. That leadership is not about inspiring people to do things. It's about making the decision that needs to be made when nobody wants to be the person making it, and then standing in front of it afterward and saying, "Times, I made that call times, regardless of how it turned out." I made 17 decisions in 18 years that I would go back and change if I could. I have thought about each of them on average twice a week since leaving service. That is what it costs to be the person making the decisions. Nobody tells you that part when you sign the contract. What I was good at, what I was, if I am being precise, exceptionally good at, was one specific thing: keeping people alive in situations where the math said they shouldn't be, not through heroics, not through the kind of thing that looks good in a speech. Through a combination of technical training, pattern recognition developed over thousands of hours in conditions most people will never experience, and a particular quality of stillness under pressure that I was born with, and that the Army refined into something almost surgical. I was not the soldier Grant Mercer described at that podium. I was something quieter and more specific than that. But by the time Grant Mercer found my story, he had already passed it through someone else's hands, and in those hands, it became something else entirely. Something usable. Something that sounded good in a ballroom. I need to tell you about Colonel Richard Payne, not because he is the villain of this story, although he is the villain of this story, but because understanding what he did requires understanding what kind of man does a thing like that, and Colonel Richard Payne was a very specific kind of man. The kind that is so thoroughly convinced of his own centrality to every situation that he eventually becomes unable to distinguish between what actually happened and what would have happened if he had been the one doing it. Richard Payne was, in the specific taxonomy of men who do damage, the most dangerous kind. Not the man who means harm, but the man who means nothing in particular and causes it anyway. He did not wake up in the mornings and decide to be dishonest. He woke up, made decisions, and then arranged his memory of those decisions into a shape that reflected well on him. He did this automatically, the way some people breathe without awareness, without effort, without the friction that would have been necessary for him to stop. I had known men like him in the army. They are not rare. They rise to certain levels by being effective at the things that are visible and unaccountable at the things that are not. They write good reports. They give good briefings. They shake the right hands at the right moments. They are at their best when the stakes are abstract and their worst when the stakes are specific, when an actual person's life is the variable and not a number on a slide. He was my commanding officer in Kunar province in 2009. Technically, in practice, he ran operations from a forward operating base, 40 minutes from the action by vehicle, and considerably further by every other measure. He was good at paperwork. He was good at managing upward, at presenting the work of his unit to his superiors, in a way that reflected well on him personally. He had the kind of confidence that reads as competence until you have seen it fail, and most of the people around him had not yet seen it fail. I had seen it fail twice. Once in 2007, when a decision he made about convoy timing put 3 of my people in a position they should not have been in, and cost us 48 hours of exposure that a simpler choice would have avoided. Once in 2009, 4 days before August 14th, when he overruled my recommendation about patrol composition, for reasons I will not go into here because they make me angrier now than they did then, and I was angry enough then to have said things I normally wouldn't say to a superior officer. He documented those things I said. He made sure of that. The incident in 2010, the one I mentioned but did not describe in full, was a formal inquiry into the events of August 14th. An inquiry, not a full investigation. The difference matters. A full investigation would have involved subpoenas, sworn testimony, an official record that could not be revised. An inquiry is softer. It involves interviews. It involves reports. It involves commanding officers who write summaries of those interviews and submit them upward. And in that process of summarization, things can shift. Emphasis can move. Context can become compressed in ways that change what the compressed version implies. Payne wrote the summary of my interview. I did not know this until 4 years later, when a FOIA request turned up a document. I had not previously seen a 2-page summary of an interview that I had participated in for 45 minutes. The summary was accurate in its facts and dishonest in its framing. It described my role on the ridge correctly. The wound management, the radio coordination, the extraction of specialist Voss. What it did not include, what had been compressed out, was my account of the patrol composition decision made 4 days earlier. The decision I had objected to. The recommendation that had been overruled. The summary made it look like a night of chaos that we had survived through individual bravery. It was that. It was also a night that did not have to happen the way it happened. Payne knew both things. He wrote only one of them. I filed a complaint. The complaint went through the standard process and was resolved through the standard resolution, which is to say it was reviewed and found to be within acceptable parameters of summary discretion and filed in a drawer somewhere in the Pentagon, where it has presumably been sitting ever since. The Army is a bureaucracy. Bureaucracies protect their documentation even when what they are protecting is the documentation of a failure to document accurately. This is not cynicism. This is just the way large organizations function, and I have made my peace with it, mostly. What I could not make peace with, what I spent several years unable to fully process, was the specific texture of what it feels like to have someone else write the summary of your story while you were alive and present, capable of writing it yourself. It is a very particular kind of erasure. Not dramatic, not violent, just quiet and thorough. The way a draft will carry away a page of notes if a window is left open, and you come back to find the page gone and the window open and no specific moment to identify as the moment when it happened. I had spent 18 years learning to make decisions under conditions where the consequences of the decision were real and immediate and entirely mine. And then I came home, and I discovered that the record of those decisions, the official, institutional record that would outlast my memory of them, was a document I had not written and could not revise. That is the thing that took the longest to forgive. Not Payne, not even Mercer, in the end. The thing that took the longest was forgiving myself for not understanding, in 2010, that I needed to fight harder for the written record, that I had trusted a process that was not built to be trusted in the way I was trusting it. I had brought to that inquiry the same discipline and precision I brought to every professional situation. The assumption that accuracy was the goal, and that accurate people pursuing the goal together would arrive at an accurate result. It was a naive assumption. It was also, perhaps, the last naive assumption I had left by that point in my life, and losing it cost more than it should have. The fight on the 14th of August 2009 was not supposed to happen the way it happened. No fight ever is. But this one was shaped by choices made before it began, and some of those choices were his. I will not say that directly in a way I haven't earned the right to say, because I was not in command and I do not know everything he knew. What I know is what I saw. What I know is that at 11:47 p.m. in the Kunar province, I was on a ridge with 4 soldiers, 2 of whom were dead within the first 6 minutes, and I made a series of decisions over the next 40 minutes that kept the other 2 alive until extraction. I did not pray. I applied pressure to a wound that should not have been survivable. I directed return fire using a radio with a cracked casing and a battery that was at 17% when we made contact, and at 0% when the extraction team reached us. I carried a man named Specialist Daniel Voss who weighed 214 pounds in his gear 40 meters through terrain that I cannot describe adequately in language that people who have not been on that ridge will fully picture, and I set him down behind a rock formation that gave us cover, and I told him not to die, and he did not die. He is alive now. He sells insurance in Bozeman, Montana. He has 2 daughters. He sent me a photo of the younger one last Christmas. She has red hair and she is wearing a sweater that says merry and bright across the front, and she is laughing at something off camera. I keep that photo on my refrigerator. I don't keep it there to remind myself of what I did. I keep it there because it is a photo of a laughing child, and laughing children are a good thing to see first thing in the morning. The 2 people I could not bring home that night were Sergeant First Class Thomas Wick, 31 years old, from Provo, Utah, who had a wife and a 4-year-old son, and who had been in the Army for 9 years, and who was, by any professional measure, the best soldier I served with in 18 years, and Specialist Elena Martinez, 22 years old, from El Paso, Texas, who had been in the Army for 14 months, and who had, in those 14 months, managed to become the kind of person that more experienced soldiers unconsciously oriented toward in difficult moments, the gravitational pull of someone who is simply, constitutionally, unafraid, in the way that some rare people are unafraid, not because they don't understand the danger, but because they have decided, at some level below language, that the danger is a variable they can work with. She had a photograph of her family in her front breast pocket. Her mother and father, 2 younger brothers, what appeared to be a grandmother with white hair and an expression of absolute authority. She had shown it to me once, unprompted, on a transit flight between forward positions. I had looked at it and said it was a good photograph, and she had said, "My grandmother is the one who runs things," and laughed. And I had laughed. I think about that photograph often, not the image of it, which has faded in my memory to an impression rather than a picture. The fact of it, the specific choice she made to keep it in her front breast pocket, close to the surface, accessible, like something she might want to refer to. A reminder of what she was working toward. A north point. I did not know her well enough. That is the truest thing I can say. 14 months is not enough time, and forward positions are not environments where people have the leisure to become fully known to one another. I knew her professionally. I knew her competence. I knew the quality of her stillness under pressure, and the way she communicated critical information with the minimum of words necessary and no more. I did not know her well enough, and she is gone. And Grant Mercer built a company on a story that happened the same night she died, and he never once mentioned her name. That, in the end, is what I could not forgive. When I came home, when I processed out of Fort Campbell in the fall of 2011 after the evaluation board, after the paperwork, after the conversations I had with the Army psychiatrist who was professional and thorough and could not quite hide that he had never been where I had been, I told that story to no one, not my mother, not my 2 surviving sisters, not the VA counselor I saw 6 times before deciding that the process of describing the thing was costing me more than the thing itself, which may or may not have been the right calculation but was the one I made. I came home to Harlan County for 3 months. Then I moved to Nashville. Then I got a job doing facilities logistics for a hospital system, which is less interesting than it sounds, and also less interesting than anything I had done for the previous 18 years, but which paid reliably and did not ask me to make decisions that mattered in the way decisions used to matter. I was fine with that for a while. And then, 7 years after the 14th of August, 2009, A woman I had worked with at the hospital mentioned that she had seen a presentation at a conference, a startup fundraising pitch, and the man presenting had told a story that she thought sounded like something that might have happened overseas, something military, and it had made her think of me for a reason she couldn't quite articulate. Her name was Deborah Park. She worked in procurement. We ate lunch together on Tuesdays because our breaks aligned and the cafeteria was quieter on the east side where we both preferred to sit. She had never asked me about my service, not once in 4 years, which was one of the reasons I trusted her. She pulled up a video on her phone. I watched 45 seconds of it. I heard Grant Mercer say the word "Times Prayed." I set the phone down on the table between us. Very carefully. The way you set down a glass that is full to the rim, and that you do not want to spill. Deborah was looking at me with an expression that she was clearly trying to make neutral. She did not entirely succeed. There was something in her eyes, not pity, which I could not have tolerated, but a kind of careful alertness. She was watching to see what I would do. "Where did you find this?" I asked. "Their investor page," she said. "They put it up on YouTube. It's been there for 2 years. 2 years. The video had been live for 2 years, and I had not known, because I did not move in circles where startup pitch decks were discussed, and because the specific combination of keywords that would have surfaced it for me, my name, my unit designation, the date, was a combination I had not thought to search. Why would I search for the story of something I had lived? I went home that night and I sat in my apartment for 4 hours without turning on any lights. I am not someone who sits in the dark as a rule. I find it uncomfortable in ways that are not useful. But that night I sat in the dark because I needed the room to be what it was. A room, a contained space with walls, while I worked through what I had just seen. I did not cry. I did not feel what I would have expected to feel, which was rage. I felt something much quieter and much more strange. I felt the particular sensation of suddenly understanding a thing that had been confusing you for a long time, the click of a shape fitting into a space you didn't know was there. Because there were things about 2010, about the inquiry, about certain details of the after-action that had never quite resolved for me. Small inconsistencies that I had filed away without filing them. The kind of thing that lives at the back of your mind in a folder you rarely open, because what's in it is not quite legible, and opening it costs more than ignoring it. I had maintained that folder for 7 years. And sitting in the dark that Tuesday night, I understood that I had finally found the frame the folder fit into. I want you to understand what it is to hear your story told incorrectly by someone who profited from it. It is not like hearing a rumor about yourself. It is not like being misquoted. It is something more specific and more violating than that. It is the experience of watching someone hold up an object that belongs to you, that was made from your body, from the hardest thing you ever did, and use it as a prop, as set dressing, as the emotional centerpiece of a pitch deck. It is watching something that cost you everything become something that cost someone else nothing, and then watch that person be rewarded for the transaction. That is what Grant Mercer did. And here is the part that took me another 2 years to put together. He didn't steal it directly. He couldn't have. He had no access to classified after-action reports. He had no contact with anyone in my chain of command at the time of the incident. He had no way to know what happened on that ridge in the detail that he described it. The isolation, the choice, the stillness, unless someone told him. I started making calls. I am methodical by training and by nature. I do not rush toward a conclusion when a different conclusion is still possible. I called people I had served with. I called people who had been at Fort Campbell during my processing out. I called a man who had been in the JAG office during an incident review that took place in 2010 that I will not describe in full because it involves things that are still, technically, under official discretion. It took me 4 calls. Colonel Richard Payne had left the Army in 2013. He had gone into consulting the defense consulting industry, which is where a certain kind of retired officer goes when they have cultivated the right contacts and want to monetize them. He had a small firm, 3 employees, a website with a photo of him in his dress uniform, which is a thing some consultants do, and which has always struck me as slightly desperate in the way that displaying your high school football trophies in your adult office is slightly desperate. His firm had a client list that included, in its 3rd year of operation, a company called Vanguard Applied Systems, Grant Mercer's company. Vanguard Applied Systems was, at its core, a defense technology firm that built software for logistics coordination in active combat environments, which is a real and legitimate thing to build. The The problem that Grant Mercer had been running from for 3 years by the time he stood at that podium in Dallas was that the company's founding story was built on a contract that had been awarded through a patience of black slate process that was not clean. Not illegal by the standard that would have put anyone in handcuffs, but not clean. The kind of not clean that defense contractors learn to live with, and investors learn to ignore when the numbers are good and the story is good and the man at the podium is good at telling it. The story was the insurance policy. As long as Grant Mercer had that story, the soldier, the ridge, the prayer, the decision he had, something no audit could touch. He had a founding mythology. He had the kind of moral authority that makes investors feel that they are not just making money, but participating in something that means something. He had a human being's sacrifice converted into a brand asset. He just didn't have the human being's permission. And he had one detail wrong. I need to tell you about the year before the Dallas event, because it is important to understand what I tried first. I tried the right way. I hired an attorney. I spent 11 months and $31,000 I had saved over the previous 6 years attempting to pursue this through proper channels, through cease and desist letters, through a civil suit for misappropriation of likeness and military service record, through a complaint filed with the Defense Contract Audit Agency about the underlying procurement issues that Payne's involvement had exposed. 11 months, $31,000. What I got back was a settlement offer of $40,000 less than my legal fees and a non-disclosure agreement that would have required me to sign away my right to ever speak about Grant Mercer, Vanguard Applied Systems, Colonel Richard Payne, or the events of the 14th of August 2009 for the rest of my life. They sent the offer on a Thursday. On Saturday, I drove to Fort Campbell, not for any official reason. I just needed to be somewhere that knew what I had been, for a few hours, before I made the next decision. I stood at the gate. I didn't go in. I just stood there for about 10 minutes. A young specialist walked past me on his way out to his car. He couldn't have been more than 22. He had that particular posture that new soldiers develop, the one where they're still figuring out how to carry themselves in the uniform, still making it look like something they're wearing rather than something they are. He nodded at me. I nodded back. He kept walking. I went home and I declined the settlement. I am going to tell you now what happened at the Adolphus Hotel on the night Grant Mercer told 200 people the story of a prayer that never happened, and I am going to tell it exactly, including the parts that don't reflect well on me. Because this is my story and I have earned the right to tell it the way it actually was. The journalist's name was Laura Chen. She had been investigating Vanguard Applied Systems for 4 months. She had found the procurement irregularities through a source inside the Defense Contract Audit Agency, a source that, it turned out, had filed a complaint with the DCAA around the same time I had, although we did not know about each other at that point. She had found Payne's consulting contract. She had found the gap in Mercer's founding story, the place where a real person should have been, and wasn't. She had spent 6 weeks looking for me. She found me through Daniel Voss. Voss had agreed to be interviewed. He had, as he put it to me later when he called to warn me and apologize in the same breath, told her what he knew. What he knew was what had actually happened. He did not know at that point that Mercer had built a company on a version of it. He thought he was just telling a reporter about a woman who had saved his life. He thought he was doing me a favor. He was not wrong. When Laura Chen sat down across from me at table 17, I had been in that room for 2 hours. I had arrived early. I had found my seat assignment. I had sat down, ordered water, and watched the room fill up with people who were there to celebrate Grant Mercer, and I had spent those 2 hours deciding whether what I was about to do was the right thing, or just the satisfying thing. I had decided it was both. You were there, weren't? Not a question. I looked at her recorder on the tablecloth. I looked at her badge. I looked at her face, which was the face of someone who had been doing this long enough to know how to be still. Yes, I said. He said he. In the story. He's had it for a long time, I said. Some details shift. She glanced toward the podium, where Grant Mercer was still working the room, shaking hands, laughing the laugh of a man at the peak of his public life. Then she looked back at me. Will you talk to me? I thought about the $31,000. I thought about the settlement offer. I thought about the non-disclosure agreement sitting unsigned in my attorney's email draft folder. I thought about Daniel Voss's daughter in the sweater that said Marion Bright. I'll talk to you, I said. But not here. Not tonight. She nodded. She picked up the recorder. She did not turn it off. She hadn't turned it on in the first place, I realized. It had just been there. A presence. A signal. Why tonight then? She asked. Why come here at all, if not to say something? I looked at Grant Mercer. He had spotted someone across the room he wanted to see. I could tell by the way his face changed, the slight recalibration toward maximum wattage. He began moving through the crowd with the practiced ease of a man who has spent years being the most important person in whatever space he occupies. He was very good at it. He would have been very good at almost anything, I thought, if he had been willing to build it on something real. Because I needed to see his face, I said, while he was still certain. Laura Chen wrote something in her notebook. Then she closed it. Same, she said. The story ran in the Dallas Morning News on a Thursday, 41 days later. 12,000 words. 3 sources confirmed on record me, Daniel Voss, and a former Vanguard employee who had been aware of the procurement issues and had, apparently, been waiting for someone to ask him about it for 2 years. The story was picked up nationally by Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, 3 of Vanguard's major investors had requested emergency calls with the board. By Friday at 10 a.m., the story had been shared 47,000 times. By 3 p.m., 212,000. By Saturday, it was something I stopped tracking, because tracking it was making me feel something I did not have an adequate name. For not pride, not satisfaction, but something adjacent to both, and also adjacent to grief, which is a combination I was not prepared for, and which I have since learned is not uncommon in situations like this, if situations like this constitute anything like a recognizable category. The call that surprised me most was not from my attorney. She called at 8:15 Friday morning, professional and pleased, to discuss options that had not existed the previous week. It was not from Daniel Voss, who had already called Thursday night. It was not from my sister in Louisville, who left a voicemail at noon that included the phrase, "I always knew you were something. Die. I just didn't know you were times that," which is the most accurate and most affecting thing anyone said to me that entire week. It was from a woman named Captain Anita Reyes, currently serving at Fort Bragg, who had found my contact information through a veterans organization and called me on Saturday afternoon to say that she had read the story and wanted me to know that she was in a situation at her installation that rhymed with mine. Not identical. Not military fraud. But the specific situation of having her professional record summarized by someone with authority over the document and insufficient knowledge of what they were summarizing. She did not ask me for advice. She said she wanted to know whether it was possible to have the record corrected, whether it was possible to wait 15 years and not become bitter and still arrive at the correct ending. I told her I did not know if I had arrived at the correct ending. I told her I had arrived at times and times ending, and that it was cleaner than I had expected, and that the path to it had been longer and more expensive than I had expected, and that I would do it again. She said, "That's enough. Thank you. We have been in contact several times since. She is still serving. Her situation is, as far as I can tell from the outside, moving toward resolution through channels more responsive than the ones I encountered, which I choose to read as evidence that something, somewhere, has improved slightly, or at least that she was better positioned than I was to navigate those channels. I do not know which. It does not matter. What matters is that she called. That the story, once corrected, did something beyond existing. I did not read most of the coverage. I read Laura Chen's piece once, carefully, the way I used to read after-action reports. She had gotten it right. Every detail. The ridge, the wound, the radio battery, the 40 meters, Daniel Voss. She had not printed the word times, prayed times except in quotation marks, attributing it to Mercer, next to a paragraph that made clear it had not happened. She had described me as a woman who, for 15 years, had declined to tell her own story. I thought about that phrase for a while. I had not declined. I had simply not been asked. And the one time I had tried to tell it through the legal process, through the right channels, I had been offered $40,000 in silence. Richard Payne was contacted by the paper before publication. He declined to comment. His consulting firm's website went offline 3 weeks after the story ran. His LinkedIn profile disappeared the week after that. I have not heard his name mentioned in any official capacity since. Grant Mercer issued a statement through his PR firm. It used the word times regret times 4 times and the phrase times earnest error times twice and did not include the word times apology times The statement said that Vanguard Applied Systems remained committed to its mission and that the story that had inspired its founding, while told with some imprecision, still reflected the values at the company's core. The board did not agree. The SEC began a preliminary inquiry into the procurement process 6 weeks after the story ran. The board asked Grant Mercer to step down from the CEO position in the third week of the inquiry. He stepped down. The company underwent restructuring that, by the following year, had reduced it to approximately 14% of its previous valuation. There were layoffs. There were lawsuits filed by investors. There was a lengthy, and from what I understand, genuinely miserable legal process that I was not part of and did not follow closely, because by that point I had stopped thinking about Grant Mercer every day and did not want to start again. The $2.1 billion company no longer exists in any meaningful form. I was not happy about that exactly. I want to be precise about what I felt, because I think it matters. I felt that an account had been settled. I felt that something crooked had been straightened. I felt for about 3 days, maybe 4, the very specific relief of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. Not triumph. Not satisfaction in the way that satisfaction gets described in stories like this, where the person who was wronged gets to stand over the wreckage of their wrongdoer and feel entirely righteous and entirely clean. I don't think I have ever felt entirely righteous and entirely clean about anything in my life, including this. There were people at Vanguard who had nothing to do with any of it. People who had taken a job because it paid well and it seemed like meaningful work, and who had no idea that the founding story their company had been built on was borrowed without permission from a woman they'd never heard of. Those people lost jobs. I did not feel good about that. I did not feel that it was my fault either, but I did not feel good about it. Grant Mercer made those choices. The consequences belong to him. I have said that to myself probably 200 times since the story ran, and it is true. And it also does not fully neutralize the discomfort of knowing that a thing set in motion partly by your actions has unintended edges. That is the part of the story that doesn't fit neatly into the ending. I'm telling it anyway. Daniel Voss called me the Thursday the story ran. He apologized again for talking to Laura Chen without warning me first. I told him to stop apologizing because he had done nothing wrong. He asked if I was okay. I said yes. He said he was glad. There was a pause. The kind that happens when two people have been in a situation that is too large for normal conversation to adequately address, and then he said, "She would have been 23 this year." Martinez. He meant Specialist Elena Martinez, who was one of the 2 people we lost that night, 22 years old, from El Paso. She had a photograph of her family in her front breast pocket. I know this because I saw it on the mountain, in the dark, in a context I will not describe more fully than that. I know, I said. I just think about that sometimes, he said. Me too, I said. We said goodbye. I think we will probably talk again at some point. We have this specific bond of 2 people who survived something together, which is not the same as friendship but is something that does not have a better name. I went back to work the following Monday. Facilities, logistics, the same hospital system. My manager, a man named Gerald who has never served anywhere and is genuinely good at his job and could not be more different from me if he had been designed to be different from me, asked if I was okay when I came in. He had apparently read something about the story. I said I was fine. He nodded in the way that people nod when they want to say more but have decided not to. I appreciated that. I stayed in Nashville for another 8 months. Then I left. I did not leave because of anything that happened with Mercer or the story. I left because I had been in Nashville for 12 years, and I had gotten from it what it had to give me, and it was time to go somewhere else. I moved to Asheville, North Carolina, which is the kind of place where no one asks too many questions and the mountains are near enough to see every day, and where I have since found a rhythm of life that is, if not the life I expected, something genuinely mine. I work part-time for a veteran support organization. I am not a counselor, I do not have that training, and I do not think I have that temperament. I help with logistics, events, the unglamorous administrative infrastructure that keeps an organization functioning. I am good at it. I am better at it than I was at my previous job because I have stopped fighting against the fact that this is what I do now, and fighting against a fact spends energy that can go elsewhere. I still have the photo of Daniel Voss's daughter on my refrigerator. She is 7 now. He sends a Christmas photo every year without fail. She has graduated from the merry and bright sweater to one that says joy in large letters. I think the enthusiasm for seasonal knitwear is a family trait. There is a card I have kept for 15 years in the back of my wallet, behind my driver's license and my library card. It is not a military ID. It is a note card, 3 inches by 5 inches, on which I wrote one thing on the night of the 14th of August, 2009, before I left the FOB for the last time. The names of the 4 people who were on that ridge with me. All 4 names. Including the 2 I could not bring home. I wrote them so that they would exist in my handwriting. So that whatever happened next, the record of them existed somewhere that could not be revised. I still carry that card. Not because I need to be reminded, but because the weight of it, in the back of my wallet, is a specific and correct weight. It is the weight of something that happened and cannot unhappen. I find that I prefer my weights to be honest. Grant Mercer had his own weight. He had been carrying it for 15 years in the other direction, not the weight of what happened, but the weight of having converted what happened into something lighter and more useful. Into a story that fit a ballroom. Into a prayer that never occurred. Into a version of a person he had never met and could not have known. The thing about weight is that you can offload it. You can sell it, lend it, perform it away. The trick is that you are the only one who knows whether you actually put it down or just pretended to. Grant Mercer put down his trophy that night in Dallas. I'm told he set it on the table before he left. I'm told he left quickly, before the room cleared, before the applause had fully stopped. I'm told that the glass caught the light from the chandelier as he set it down and that it looked, for a moment, quite beautiful. I don't know if that's true. I wasn't watching him by then. I was watching Laura Chen cross the room toward the exit. Notebook in her bag, recorder in her pocket, moving with the particular economy of someone who had what they came for. She stopped at my table on her way out. She held out her hand. I shook it. She said, "Thank you." I said, "Don't thank me. Just get it right." She got it right. I drove home that night in my 2017 Honda Accord with 94,000 miles on it. The highway was empty past 11. The dashboard light was amber and steady, the way it always is. The radio was off. I thought about nothing in particular for about 40 minutes, which is not as easy to do as it sounds, and which I have gotten better at over the years than I used to be. I took the exit. I turned onto my street. I pulled into my parking space, and I sat in the car for a moment. Engine off, keys in my hand. I took the note card out of my wallet. I read the 4 names. I put it back. I went inside. There is a specific question I have been asked more than any other since the story ran, which is some version of, how did you wait so long? People want to understand the patience. They interpret it as strategy, as if I had been playing a long game, holding my moment, orchestrating the conditions for maximum impact. Some of them seem almost disappointed when I explain that this is not what happened. I waited because I did not know how to proceed. I waited because the legal process was slow and expensive and eventually closed. I waited because there were stretches of years where I was honestly not sure that the story deserved the energy it would take to correct it, where I had arrived at a kind of exhausted détente with the situation, a willingness to let it exist in its incorrect form somewhere out there in the world while I got on with my life. Patience as strategy is a form of power. Patience as necessity is just endurance. For most of those 15 years, what I was doing was the latter. The distinction matters to me, even if it doesn't change the outcome. I do not want to be the person who claims credit for a long game I was not playing. I was surviving. I was working. I was building a life out of the materials available to me, which were considerable in some ways and quite limited in others, and which did not include, for most of that period, any clear path to what I actually wanted. What I actually wanted was simple and strange, and took me a long time to admit. I wanted the record to reflect what happened. Not for the world, not for posterity, not so that history would be kind to me, or so that Grant Mercer would face consequences, or so that Richard Payne would be exposed. I wanted, simply and specifically, for the account to be accurate. For what happened on that ridge in Kunar Province on the 14th of August, 2009, to exist somewhere in the record in its actual form, the wound, the radio, the 40 meters, the 2 people we lost, the 2 people who came home. No prayer that didn't happen. No meaning imposed from the outside by someone who needed a story more than he needed the truth. That is a small thing to want. It is also, I have found, one of the harder things to get. Laura Chen gave it to me. Or rather, she gave me the platform to give it to myself, which is a different and more accurate way of saying it. The story in the Dallas Morning News was her reporting, her sourcing, her 12,000 words of research and interview and verification. But the facts in that story were mine. They had always been mine. They were waiting, for 15 years, for someone to ask for them correctly. The evening after the story ran, I went for a walk. Nothing planned. I do not plan walks. I just put on shoes and left my apartment and walked until it felt like enough. It was already dark. Asheville in the fall has a particular quality in the dark. The mountains are not visible, but they are present. The way people who have been in a room can still be present in a room after they have left it. There is a kind of weight to the air that is not unpleasant. I walked for about 40 minutes. I did not think about Grant Mercer. I did not think about the story, or the coverage, or what came next. I thought about a night in 2011 when I was processing out of Fort Campbell, standing in a parking lot at 11 p.m. with a duffel bag and a phone with a cracked screen, and no particular idea of what came after. I had driven to Harlan County, stopping twice on the way, once for gas, once because I thought I was going to cry, and preferred to do it in a rest area rather than on the highway, which I recognize is a specific kind of preference but one that made sense to me at the time. I thought about arriving at my mother's house at 2 in the morning and finding the porch light on. She always left the porch light on when she was expecting someone. I had not told her I was coming. She left it on anyway. She came to the door when she heard the car. She did not say anything, which was correct, because there was nothing to say. She held the door open. I went inside. She made tea. We sat at the kitchen table for about an hour, not talking much. And then I went to bed in my old room and I slept for 11 hours, which was the most I had slept consecutively in. I did not calculate it. A long time. I thought about that, walking in the dark in Asheville. And I thought that the thing that had mattered most in those years was not the legal process, or the investigation, or the story in the paper. It was the porch light, the small, specific, entirely ordinary act of keeping a light on for someone whose arrival you cannot confirm. The refusal to let the night become more permanent than it has to be. I have tried to be that kind of person. I am not always successful. I am better at it than I used to be. When I came home from that walk, I stood outside my building for a moment. The air was cold. The mountains were invisible and present. I thought about the note card in my wallet. I thought about the 4 names. I went inside and I turned on every light in my apartment, all at once. The way you do when you are home and there is nothing you need to be careful of and nowhere you need to be. I made tea. I sat at the table. And for the first time in 15 years, I thought about the 14th of August, 2009, with something that was not pain, just memory. Just the shape of a thing that happened, held in its correct proportions. The weight of it exactly what it was. No more. No less. I didn't need the world to know who I was. I had spent 18 years being exactly who I was in rooms that had no audience and in moments that would never appear in anyone's speech. I had measured my own weight privately, against standards that didn't change regardless of who was watching. Grant Mercer had his own weight. He had been carrying it for 15 years in the other direction, not the weight of what happened, but the weight of having converted what happened into something lighter and more useful, into a story that fit a ballroom, into a prayer that never occurred, into a version of a person he had never met and could not have known. The thing about weight is that you can offload it. You can sell it, lend it, perform it away. The trick is that you are the only one who knows whether you actually put it down or just pretended to. That is what the Army gave me, in the end. Not the uniform, not the rank, not the story, and certainly not what someone else did with it. The ability to know the difference between what actually happened and what sounds good when the lights are right, and the room is full and the applause is building. The difference is everything. I could live with that. I have. And for 18 years long before any of the rest of this knowing it had been enough,